I'm Lisa Senecal.
And I'm Maya May.
And tonight we're asking, did one of the nation's largest law firms help Trump become their useful idiot president to help their clients? Where Speaking starts now.
So, what comes first, the criminal president or the law firm that helped put him into office, legitimizing his BS? That's how we got right here. But more importantly, what do we do with this knowledge now that we have it? That is what I am trying to figure out today, because to be honest with you, I'm reading our guest book today and I was furious. Like I wrote a lot of expletives. There were a lot of expletives because it just doesn't seem like it should be legal, but it is. And so I'm like, do these people realize they're dismantling democracy in the process of enriching themselves? Because I'm like, they can't all be greedy sociopaths. So, but that's what I feel like they might be. That's how I feel.
It is incredibly frustrating. And it's one of the things that disillusions so many Americans about government and the people who we elect to represent it, is that there's just this huge disconnect between like how we're taught in school how government's supposed to work, and then the actual like backroom bullshit, money, unscrupulous people who have so much influence that we don't see, we don't understand, like what we're going to talk about from our guest book tonight, The Revolving Door Between Attorneys at Jones Day, one of the largest law firms in the world that represents massive corporations with real vested interest in affecting public policy and the courts. And lawyers from that firm were getting hugely influential positions in the Trump administration. And then when he didn't get reelected, they went right back to Jones Day representing those corporations. It's really staggering.
Yeah, it's kind of like wanting to be in the room where it happens, only there's two rooms and there's a secret tunnel that just goes back and forth between the rooms. It's kind of how it feels. And so tonight we're going to touch on the massive unelected right-wing power, money, and influence that's shaping our laws and political system, including SCOTUS, and how it contributed to the January 6th insurrection. Did I really just almost say what I thought I said?
I was going to let it slide, but
yes, and with that, I'm sure our guest is very excited to come on in. Let's bring in our guest.
Hi, hello. David.
Hi.
Hi, David. Thank you for joining.
Welcome. So David is an award-winning journalist, a #1 best-selling author, and the business investigations editor at the New York Times. He's also the author of, I was telling you before the show, My Newest Nightmares, and the fascinating, really maddening, unnerving book, Servants of the Damned, Giant Law Firms, Donald Trump, and the Corruption of Justice. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It truly is, and it is infuriating. I found myself shouting expletives as I was reading it because it just doesn't really seem fair. But right now, we're obviously at a critical junction in our society. So why now? Why is it important to the American public that this book was written?
Well, I mean, I think that for far too long, normal people have just kind of ignored the role that lawyers and big law firms play in our society, our economy, our democracy. And I personally have been fascinated by this topic for a very long time. I've been covering business and finance for almost 20 years now. And basically over the years, every time I cover a financial or business scandal, there's a big corporate law firm lurking in the background, not just kind of helping their clients, but also kind of manipulating the media along the way in kind of subtle ways that I've found really interesting and at times kind of troubling. And so I started paying attention to Jones Day in particular in 2020, given the extensive work they were doing, not only for the Trump campaigns, but as you guys alluded to, the Trump administration. And as we kind of, as a country, spiraled toward January 6th, I and many other people were paying even more attention to kind of the threats to our democracy. And it was really interesting to me to kind of marry these two long-term interests I had, one being law firms, big corporate law firms in general. And on the other hand, there's one particular law firm that I didn't know a whole lot about initially, that was playing what seemed like a really important and really kind of secretive and not very well, it just wasn't in the public view at all, this law firm. And I still think to this day, most of what they do and their competitors do is outside of public view. And I think that is a disservice to all of us.
Yeah, most people haven't heard of Jones Day. I know I really hadn't. So
Jones Day has had, and he's returned now, a managing partner named Richard Pogue. Is that how you pronounce his last name? He was there from 85 to 94, and he was really a monarch within the organization. He made all the decisions, no consensus building. His word was gospel. The way they function seems so in line with sort of the authoritarian nature of the Republican Party and the way Trump functions. How did we not see this coming? Why were we blind to the influence that someone like Jones Day would have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in part by the way, I had never really thought about it in quite the terms you just described it with, which is that Jones Day, as you said, has this very unique kind of management structure where the top partner at the firm, who right now is a guy named Steve Brogan, and has been for the past 20 years or so, has this basically unfettered power within the firm. And I hadn't really thought of the comparison that you might make to the Trump campaign or the Republican Party. That's interesting. I think the reason, though, that these law firms and including Jones Day, have really been outside of the public eye is there's this long-held view, I think rightly in America, that everyone who is accused of wrongdoing is entitled to competent, robust legal counsel. And that is a notion, that's enshrined in the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And it's something that is, I think, very fundamental to the way we perceive our justice system in the United States. But the legal industry has really warped that over the years into a concept that I think extends far beyond what normal people would think of as the legal services to which someone is conceivably entitled. And so the legal industry these days is not just helping accused criminals, or accused corporate criminals, I should say, to kind of defend themselves in court or against their competitors. They're helping big clients avoid taxes or move money secretly or neuter government investigations or neuter regulations or intimidate or silence whistleblowers. The list goes on. And so I think the notion that these are services that were guaranteed to anybody under the Sixth Amendment is fanciful. But I think the legal industry still has done a really good job of kind of shielding itself and immunizing itself from any outside scrutiny, much less criticism, because people hold up this idea that, well, this is what lawyers do, and everyone's entitled to lawyers basically working on their behalf. And my response to that is, yes, everyone who is accused of wrongdoing is by all means entitled to robust legal counsel, but you are not entitled to very expensive legal counsel if what you're trying to do is things like launder money or avoid taxes or intimidate whistleblowers or influence inside a government administration.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference, right, between a defense strategy and a manipulation strategy, which it seems like this firm like Jones Day and perhaps others are doing. So, the January 6th committee hearing is the next one's tomorrow, as it is scheduled. We know that could change, but as it is scheduled, it is tomorrow. And Jones Day was somewhat instrumental in a lot of the events that led up to that, as far as election denial, those sort of things. Can you talk about the through line and how Jones Day was kind of, I don't want to say co-conspirator, but
complicit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be careful here. And I think there are times when too much stuff has gotten kind of lumped together. So Jones Day started representing Trump, the Trump campaign in early 2015, was instrumental in him kind of building and then cementing credibility with the right wing of the Republican Party. Trump wins and brings into his White House and into his administration dozens of Jones Day lawyers who, among other things, are responsible for remaking the federal judiciary, and Don McGahn most prominently, but there are a bunch of others as well. and then also represents his 2020 campaign. And by the summer of 2020, as Trump was increasingly kind of warning about the risks of a tainted election and kind of essentially threatening that he was going to contest the results if he didn't like the outcome, a bunch of people inside Jones Day, including some who had been working on the campaign, started voicing a lot of concerns internally, including to the firm's leaders, about the kind of reputational and ethical risks that they faced while working for a guy like this in a campaign like this. And, you know, Jones Day did not do, as far as I've been able to figure out, did not do anything in response to those concerns, continued to represent Trump. And then shortly before the election in Pennsylvania, Jones Day was involved in litigation that it's kind of complicated, but like it basically boils down to they were trying to make it harder for absentee and mail-in ballots to count. And this was a hotly contested series of lawsuits that were going back and forth. Jones Day lost on both, or Jones Day's clients, I should say, lost on both of them. But the reaction inside the firm, especially after the election was over and Jones Day continued to fight to have ballots segregated and to stop them from being counted in some cases, the reaction was just apoplectic among many of the firm's lawyers who viewed this as Jones Day using its institutional credibility and its access and power and money to essentially suppress votes. And Jones Day contests that. They argue that they were just litigating legitimate constitutional issues on behalf of a legitimate client. And they were not involved in any of the Sidney Powell-like lawsuits. I think it's important to be clear about that. They were not the ones doing that, but they were engaged in litigation that even some of their respected lawyers within the firm viewed as anti-democratic and attempting to suppress the votes in what was the most important swing state in the entire election.
It seems like they have an agenda. Is it fair to say that?
Yeah, well, look, Jones Day is not a monolith, right? This is a law firm with something like 2,500 lawyers in 40 countries. There are Democrats who work there. There are a lot of Democrats who work there. But the firm's leaders, many of them anyway, and some of the most important practice areas within the firm, including the practice that focuses on taking cases to the Supreme Court and the practice that focuses on going up against the government, and I should say the practice that focuses on helping politicians win elections, are all dominated by not only Republicans, but Republicans who are cut from largely the same cloth, which is kind of the Federalist Society cloth. And they have a very conservative, socially and economically very conservative view of the world. And I think that is something that in large part, it meshes with the interests of their corporate clients very neatly, because they can go use the access that they've built up, say, during the Trump administration, and use that access to help their big corporate clients not just win court cases, but fend off government investigations, dilute the power of federal agencies. And we've seen this over and over again. And just given the great success that Jones Day's once and future lawyers enjoyed in remaking the federal judiciary, I think we're going to see this playing out over and over again in the future as well.
Right. That's one of the most troubling aspects of this to me, is that it didn't end with the Trump administration, because they were so successful in reshaping a lot of the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, which you've now mentioned, Don McGahn and SCOTUS. So we have to talk about this. There was this deal that was made way back when they were first representing the Trump campaign and trying to get him some street cred with conservatives around where that the list was going to come from of potential Supreme Court nominees. You also mentioned the Federalist Society. Can you talk to us about how that came to pass, and then what happened once Don McGahn was White House counsel, playing a really unusual role for a White House counsel?
Well, that list, as it's come to be known, was literally conceived of inside Jones Day's headquarters right at the foot of Capitol Hill in Washington. And in early 2016, Don McGahn, who was the Jones Day partner who was basically running the legal operations for the Trump campaign, convened a big meeting with Trump and a bunch of conservative congressmen and Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society in Jones Day's headquarters there. And that's where they came up with the idea that Trump would publicly announce a list of judges from whom he would pick his next Supreme Court nominee. And that was shortly after Scalia had died. So, and Mitch McConnell had made clear he would not be holding hearings on Merrick Garland. So it was clear that whoever the next president was would have a vacancy to fill. And it was, I think, largely Don McGahn's idea and Leonard Leo at the Federalist Society, their idea that this would help win over a lot of support from wavering Republicans who just didn't really trust that Trump was one of them. And Mitch McConnell, among others, has said that the creation of the list was probably the single most important factor in bringing conservative Republicans in line behind Trump. So I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that were it not for the kind of genius of Don McGahn, Trump may not have won the election in 2016. And this was it was a pivotal moment. And McGahn was rewarded for that, I think, because when Trump, shortly after he'd won the election, but before he took office, approached McGahn and said, "Would you like to be my White House counsel?" McGahn had been plotting for this moment with Mitch McConnell. And the advice McConnell had given to McGahn was that when Trump calls and offers you this job, you should condition it basically on having unilateral, full, unfettered power within the White House to be in charge of judicial nominations. And that was a big break from the way past presidents, Republican and Democrat, had handled this, where they would have kind of committees and seek a lot of input from Capitol Hill and come to a consensus about the right judges from a political standpoint as well as an ideological or philosophical standpoint. And so McGahn came into the White House with this really extraordinary power, and he brought with him into the White House counsel's office, and every single lawyer he brought in was a member of the Federalist Society. And quite a few of those lawyers were people that he had worked with until very recently at Jones Day. And it was just an incredibly successful mission that they embarked on. I mean, in addition to the 3 Supreme Court justices that Trump got, 2 of whom were handpicked by McGahn, and the third, Amy Coney Barrett, had been plucked by McGahn kind of out of academic obscurity with the idea that she would one day end up on the Supreme Court. But in addition to that, and a quarter of the federal appellate bench turned over. And I don't know the exact numbers, but well over 100 federal district judges were added or replaced during McGahn's time in the White House. And that is, and he had not a single-minded devotion to this cause, but he was spending a ton of time on this, and he did it well. And we see that playing out in every day. There's a court hearing, it seems like, where you're getting these judges who, qualified or not, and they are often very, they operate, I don't want to overstate this. I was going to say they operate kind of in lockstep from the same Federalist Society playbook. I think that's probably overstating it a little bit, but I don't think it's far off.
I was going to say, you don't have to state it. I'll state it because, I want this to sink in for everybody at home, because that was a lot. And when I hear it, I go, is this like attorney-client relationship, or is it a partnership? How would you characterize that level of deal making?
I mean, I think it was more of a partnership than is normal in a case like this. And I think, back through Trump's presidency, there would be stories written periodically about how Jones Day was raking in so much money from the Trump campaign and related work. And they were making millions of dollars off this work. But I think that kind of obscured the real point. This was not that much money in the grand scheme of things for a firm like Jones Day, which, generates more than $2 billion a year in revenue. This was much more about power and politics and influence. And to a large extent, the senior-most people at Jones Day, and certainly the senior-most people in kind of the key powerful practice areas that at the firm, are largely, if not entirely, dominated by people who shared the same political affiliations and political beliefs as the people that the Trump White House was putting on the court. And look, that's not an accident. It's not, if Jones Day's leaders did not want to be having this sway, they make the argument, by the way, that this is just us representing clients. We're doing what our clients ask us, no more. You shouldn't read anything into the work that we're doing on behalf of clients that does not reflect on our personal beliefs. And that's just nonsense. If they didn't want to be working for Republican candidates or wielding great influence in Republican circles, they just wouldn't do it. And it's not like that just accidentally happened. It was a direct, anticipatable result of them in 2014 deciding that they would start a political law practice. And they went out and hired a group of hotshot Republican lawyers. And one of the first new clients they brought on upon arriving at Jones Day was the Trump campaign. And then they repeatedly doubled down on the work they were doing for Trump and with the Republican Party. And these days, with this whole kind of range of not just Trump, but Trumpists, right? I mean, they are the campaign counsel for Ron Johnson. They're the campaign counsel for Dr. Oz, for Kevin McCarthy. They're working for the one of the main super PACs that's supporting Herschel Walker down in Georgia, and the list goes on. So it's not like they just stumbled into this accidentally and were responding to just incoming calls from clients. They positioned themselves very deliberately as the go-to law firm for Republican power brokers. And as the Republican Party has shifted into the party of Trump, they have been very much along for that ride, and they continue to be along for that ride, I think.
The role that they played in SCOTUS is huge, and the overall judiciary, but they implanted, had appointed their attorneys in all sorts of different departments that were making policy that would have direct impact on Jones Day clients who they had been representing immediately before they moved into the Trump administration. They were able to affect policy and then go back to Jones Day. That sounds incredibly corrupt. It sounds like we've tried to not allow elected officials to do with immediately becoming lobbyists the moment they're no longer in office. But is there anything that draws a line that prevents attorneys from being able to do this?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are ethical rules about kind of essentially cooling off periods as you go into the government and come out of the government. And again, I think it's important, out of fairness, to note that I have no reason to think that Jones Day has not been very careful about adhering to those ethical and legal rules. I mean, one of the things about these big law firms is that they are very good at themselves and having their clients follow the letter of the law and the letter of the rules in ways you can walk right up to the line, but they are very careful not to cross it. So I have no reason to think they have done otherwise here. But look, I mean, there is a kind of a long-standing system of, I think, kind of legalized corruption in Washington with this revolving door between big law firms and other big companies and the government, and then they go right back, sometimes with an implicit, sometimes having received a big kind of goodbye payment on the way into government, and with the implicit, if not explicit, understanding that they would be welcomed back with promotions and even more money upon their return. And again, this is not just about Jones Day, and Jones Day kind of did this on steroids to an extent, I think. I mean, there were more people, there's a greater concentration of power going from one particular law firm into the Trump administration than anyone I have spoken to can point to with previous law firms and previous administrations. But it really is a pattern of, and I think a very, very ugly pattern that goes back, and it's not just about Trump. This is something that was in the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, certainly the Bush administration. It's probably happening in the Biden administration too. There's something, everyone talks about draining the swamp, but there's, to me, it's hard to think of something swampier than this kind of continuously spinning revolving door. And it was, again, on steroids between Jones Day and the Trump administration in a way that I have not previously seen.
So, but there also is a distinction between what Jones Day is doing as far as what feels like trying to dismantle democracy. Like, it feels like the efforts that they're making are having like far-reaching effects, right? So if that, because one thing I'm like, oh, okay, if they're putting in people who are trying to build laws or things for our country that actually help marginalized citizens, that's one thing. But then using the revolving door to do what it feels like they're doing, which feels very purposeful. And so I'm curious about your take on this. Like, if this door doesn't stop, if they continue to do the kind of work that they're doing, what does it mean for our democracy, for stability, for our society?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know is the short answer. What I've seen, though, is that this is what differentiates Jones Day to a large extent, I think, is that it's the scale of this power transfer from one particular law firm into one particular administration and back again. The second thing, though, is that Jones Day historically was not a political law firm. They were a law firm that specialized in corporate litigation. And so they would help, big companies like RJ Reynolds, the tobacco company, or many other companies that were accused of making products that harmed their users. They would defend those companies and really go to the ends of the earth to defend them in ways that often were kind of pushing the boundaries of ethics or legality, and certainly were kind of blurring the line between science and science fiction. And the work on tobacco is like the most kind of startling example of that. And I won't bore you with that because everyone kind of knows that story by now. But the interesting thing to me is that Jones Day used their mastery of the smash mouth tactics of corporate litigation. They've imported those into the political arena in a way that I don't think the political arena or democracy is really that well equipped to deal with. And there's not a tradition in this country of using quite the no holds barred kind of savvy that these corporate law firms like Jones Day have used to get their way in court and kind of steamroll the government and steamroll plaintiffs. We now see that playing out in a place like we saw that in the White House counsel's office, I think, to a degree. And part of the reason that McGahn and his colleagues were so efficient and so effective at remaking the federal judiciary in the space of just a few years is that they attacked it with this precision and mobilization of resources that is the norm at a big corporate law firm as it's preparing to go to court to defend a client in high stakes litigation. And that's something that they bring a tremendous amount of money and street smarts and power to that game. And they do it, and it worked. It worked really, really, really well.
So, because it's just basically like they're using all of their talents to dismantle democracy. Like, that's what I'm hearing. Like, as you say it, like, it's literally sinking in for me that level of strategy is being used to undermine the very structures that protect us.
It's certainly
Please go ahead.
It's certainly undermining the notion that elected officials and politically appointed officials within big government agencies are supposed to be just looking out for taxpayers' interests with no regard to who has recently paid them or might pay them again in the future. And I think that again, that's not a problem that started with Jones Day or will end with Jones Day, but I do think it's something that Jones Day came to embody and kind of expand and supersize in a way that neither I nor most of the people I spoke to as I reported this book had ever encountered before.
It seems as though what they've done with being able to infiltrate the government to the degree that they did, especially in the Trump administration, is to sort of wildly reinterpret and expand what defending their clients, the means that they can do that. Because are they not ending up in these positions and being able to change laws, help write legislation and help put regulations and policies in place that then they have a direct impact on how they will then defend their clients against lawsuits?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like a couple of pretty good examples of this, I think, but to me, there are two that really jump out. One is the debate within the Trump administration about how to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And one of the things we've learned fairly recently is the degree to which there was this coordination between the Justice Department and the Commerce Department to kind of construct some sort of rationalization for why we should add this for reasons other than, I think, the obvious one, which is that it would disadvantage Democrats. And we've now seen in actual paperwork and documents that it was two very recently departed Jones Day lawyers who had been embedded in senior positions in the Commerce Department and in the Justice Department, who, I don't know if they masterminded it, but they were certainly the ones carrying it out. And they did it with the same kind of tactics that they would use in big corporate litigation. And they did an enormous amount of research about relevant case law and court precedents. And they came up with a strategy that would allow them to publicly, while trying to keep a straight face, a rationale that they were not trying to diminish Democratic voters or minority voters. They were trying to protect voting rights. And it's like, it would almost be funny if it weren't so just transparently nonsensical and hypocritical. And again, that's not me saying that. Well, it is actually me saying that, but that's also what members of Congress have said. It's what federal courts have said. So this is not something I'm going out on a limb. But the other kind of big priority that Don McGahn had when he came into the White House with Trump was the dismantling of what he liked to refer to and disparage as the administrative state, which is basically the power of regulatory agencies that are run by unelected officials, of their politically appointed officials, to exert control over private companies and private citizens and regulate things like the environment and, the automobile industry and things like that. And McGahn has made it his mission for a long time to basically rein in the power of agencies like this. And so we now have a situation where McGahn and other people in the Trump administration were actively pushing administrative agencies to stop enforcing or stop using the powers they had. A. B, they were adding judges to the courts that shared this kind of antipathy toward the administrative state. And C, both at the time and now upon the return to private practice, Jones Day was representing clients that were going to court to challenge the use of administrative power in policing industries and clamping down on companies that polluted the environment or did things that were apparently against the law. And so it's kind of this triumvirate of the power wall in the White House, the power that was added to the federal judiciary, and the power that this very savvy, very large, very well-financed corporate law firm brings in selecting cases that it's going to bring into the federal court system. And the result has been cases like the big EPA case that was announced by the Supreme Court last June, where the court found that the EPA basically had exceeded its authority as it sought to regulate carbon emissions that coal-fired power plants were producing. And lo and behold, three of the justices that wrote that opinion were the new Trump appointees, two of whom, again, McGahn had appointed. And the company that brought that case was a coal company that was a Jones Day client. And so it was Jones Day that had brought that case to the Supreme Court. And just days before that Supreme Court decision was announced at the end of June, maybe it was early July, and Amy Coney Barrett was at a party up in New York, a birthday party hosted by one of Jones Day's top partners, where she was hanging out with people, including Noel Francisco, who had been the Trump administration Solicitor General and had come back to Jones Day, where his job involved, he was running the DC office, where he was presiding over a bunch of lawyers, including the ones who had brought this case challenging the EPA authority that the court would rule on just days after he was hanging out with Amy Coney Barrett. And I'm not saying there's any actual causal connection between them partying together and the decision, but boy, it's not a good look.
It sure looks really fucking corrupt.
I was gonna say, I was like, it's freaking terrible. And it's like, yes, I believe that the more we know, the further we go. And so this information, it's infuriating. And at the same time, I ask how do we stop it? I know we have to wrap, but I think this is a conversation that I want everyone to have at home. That's an ongoing conversation, because we can't, it's when it's not criminal, but it feels criminal. Maybe it should be criminal is.
And more people need to be paying attention to it. I mean, it's where you started, David. There just isn't enough attention being paid to this. So thank you for writing your book.
Yes.
I hope everyone will read The Servants of the Damned. It's a really, really important book, which I hope you've been able to gather from this conversation. Yeah. So thank you for your work, David.
Yes,
thanks for having me. It's been nice talking with you guys.
Me too.
I like that he's somewhat chill, because we just read it, so I'm still furious. I'm like, this can't be. But it is so important, because, we're all trying to live our lives. And a lot of times we don't realize the things that happen in the background that are being orchestrated, that are working against us day in and day out. And, when we had Terry Canfield on, she said everybody should have a year of law school instead of I think it was sophomore year of high school. And it's like, maybe that is what we need, because at this point, it seems like it's stacked against us. And so, yes, read his book, everyone.
Read his book. Yeah, it's It's one of the reasons why the Lincoln Project does not accept corporate money for the work that we do. It's why we depend on all of you to keep the work that we're all doing together, not just the people who are on staff at the Lincoln Project, but all of us, all the pro-democracy people out there who are helping to support the Lincoln Project. So thank you for the contributions you make. They make a huge difference. Anything that you're able to do on an ongoing basis or a one-time basis is so greatly appreciated. We've got, 27 days until the midterms. There is a lot to do, but there's a lot that can be accomplished. So please do help if you can. And also, join the union. Go to jointheunion.us. There are so many volunteer opportunities. There is something for everybody there. You have talents. All of us have a tiny bit of time. And I can't think of anywhere more important to spend that time in the next 27 days than trying to make sure that we still live in a democratic republic.
Yeah, because we're going to have a lot less time if we don't have a democratic republic, because let me tell you, like, it's not going to be fun. And then we're going to be scrambling, trying to figure out how we pick up the pieces of our lives. We don't want to be there. Yes. So continuing the talk about elections, there's going to be a Twitter space tonight on Pennsylvania. We've been spotlighting Pennsylvania this week because it is critical to democracy and there are races there. As you know, Oz Fetterman, it's really important to pay attention to these races. So head on to Twitter. You can follow Lisa there at Elsie Senecal and me at Maya on Stage. And that the Twitter space is with Jeff Timmer and Tara Setmayer at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Yep. And tomorrow, after the January 6th hearing, as soon as it ends, there's going to be a special breakdown with Tara Setmayer and Rick Wilson. Make sure you watch that. We're going to be able to get the immediate first impressions and some analysis from Rick and Tara on whatever it is that's going to blow our minds tomorrow that we didn't realize could have possibly been going on, and just how bad it was. So make sure you join them. And we want to leave you with an ad tonight. It's the Lincoln, one of the groups that the Lincoln Project is so fond of. And Mark Hamill is a voice you're probably going to recognize in this ad. He did the voiceover. He's been an incredible champion for pro-democracy causes for a long time now. So please join the Twitter space, 8 o'clock tonight, and take a look at this ad.
Weeks to go until the most important election in decades. So much is on the line. Our rights, our freedoms. It's a choice between compassion and conspiracy. Between hope for a better America and a rising autocratic movement. In some states, it's harder to vote than it was before, which is why it's so important to do just that. We've fought too hard and too long protecting the right to vote to let a few politicians take away our voice. Check your registration status. Get your absentee ballot early. Know your precinct. And don't let anyone tell you that your vote won't matter. American democracy is on the line. Your rights are on the line. Because if we don't turn out in this election, it could be our last.